Born on April 3rd of 1966, Laureen Ron was raised primarily by her mother in Manchester, New Hampshire. By the time she entered her teenage years, Laureen and her mother were living in a third-floor apartment on Merrimack Street. She was said to be a good student, popular among her peers, and her relationship with her mother was a healthy one. Laureen also dreamed of becoming an actress and took singing and dancing lessons outside of her time at Parkside Junior High School. But as she approached her 14th birthday, things started to change. According to Laureen's aunt, she was an angel who hung around with the wrong people. But perhaps a more utilitarian explanation was that Laureen began to make some very poor choices. She neglected her singing and dancing to drink alcohol and smoke marijuana. And while this is a common and relatively harmless form of teenage rebellion, it might well have been indicative of a much more sinister problem. On the evening of April 26, 1980, Laureen's mother, Judith Ron, left her daughter home alone so she could visit her tennis player boyfriend competing in a tournament. Laureen would normally accompany her mother on these trips, but on this occasion, she asked to stay home. Believing her daughter was old enough to take care of herself, Judith departed in the early afternoon after arranging for a handful of relatives to stop by and check on Laureen throughout the day. These checks were performed on schedule, with visitors observing that Laureen was relaxing alone. But Laureen was no fool. She was simply waiting for the last of her relatives to come and go, and when the coast was clear, she called her friends and invited them over. A few hours later, two of Laureen's friends showed up at her apartment to find her with a 6-pack of beer and a bottle of wine. The group drank and smoked for the next couple of hours until around 12:30 a.m. when they began to hear voices in the hallway outside the apartment. Assuming this was Laureen's mother returning from dinner with her boyfriend, one of Laureen's two friends rushed out of the apartment's back door and down the iron stairwell. The friend was a boy and a little older than Laureen, meaning that her mother would most certainly not approve of him being there so late. So after ushering him out of the back, Laureen locked the door and rushed back to where her female friend was to maintain the ruse. The next 45 minutes are a complete mystery. The only thing we know for certain is that whoever those voices belonged to outside in the hallway, they didn't belong to Laureen's mother or her tennis-playing boyfriend because they didn't get home until just after 1:15 a.m. Upon entering her apartment building in the early hours of April 27th, the first thing Judith Ron did was flick on the light switch, illuminating the main communal hallway. Yet the hallway remained in darkness. Confused by the sudden power outage, her boyfriend checked the building's fuse box but discovered that everything was in order. It was around then that Judith discovered the reason none of the hallway lights were working. Someone had unscrewed the bulbs ever so slightly, and they had done so on every single floor. Naturally, the couple found this extremely disconcerting and rushed up to Judith's apartment to check on her daughter. They found the front door unlocked and undamaged. When they walked inside and switched on the lights, everything seemed to be in order. Laureen's bedroom was dark and silent, but her mother could see the clear shape of someone lying underneath the covers. Judith breathed a deep sigh of relief, but just to be certain, she approached her sleeping daughter to see if everything was okay. It was not Laureen. Judith Ron found herself staring into the bloodshot, dilated pupils of Laureen's female friend. When asked where Laureen was, her friend had no clue. The severely intoxicated girl explained that around midnight, she and Laureen had decided to get some sleep, but instead of climbing into bed, Laureen had offered it to her guest while she opted for the couch in the apartment's main living area. The friend seemed to have no idea that she had been alone in the apartment for the last 45 minutes or so, and together, the trio started to panic. Judith rushed to call 911 while her boyfriend began searching the surrounding area behind the wheel of her car. Just after 3:45 a.m., Laureen Ron officially became a missing person. In the weeks that followed, the prevailing theory among investigating police officers was that Laureen was a runaway. They pointed to the fact that there were no signs of struggle in the apartment and echoed the testimony of a bus station employee who claimed to have sold a ticket to a girl matching Laureen's description on the day she disappeared. However, when shown a photograph of Laureen, this same employee claimed that he was no longer certain. While the runaway theory could not be ruled out, police began to question the two friends Laureen had been with that night. The girl claimed to have passed out shortly after 12:30 a.m. and that her memory of that night's events was extremely hazy due to the alcohol she had consumed. She remembered hearing voices outside of the apartment shortly before she fell asleep, but considered nothing else suspicious. Laureen's male friend admitted to being in the apartment that night, but as we've already covered, he stated that he rushed out of the back once he heard the voices. It's worth noting that the boy seemed extremely nervous during police questioning and, at one point, admitted to feeling extremely guilty due to his choice of actions. While some might consider this enough to make him a suspect, he insisted that he had nothing to do with Laureen's disappearance. His regret was based on the idea that if he had stayed, things might have gone very differently if an abduction had indeed occurred. Law enforcement seemed satisfied with the boy's explanation and have never officially considered him a suspect, but later developments bring that conclusion into doubt. 6 months went by, and the police had yet to make a breakthrough in the case. Then one day, Judith Ron noticed a strange anomaly regarding her phone bill. On October 1st, Judith was looking over her bill when she noticed a pair of unfamiliar phone numbers. One of the numbers belonged to a motel in Santa Monica, California, while the other was assigned to the Teen Health Hotline. Police managed to get in touch with the hotline's operator, who turned out to be a physician based in Santa Ana. He claimed the hotline provided health advice to teenage girls, and most of their questions involved intimate wellness and the use of contraceptive devices. Yet the hotline served another purpose. The physician claimed that several calls came from women and girls in the group of exploitation, and that on a handful of occasions, he and his wife had helped these girls escape their nightmarish predicaments. He also added that Annie Sprinkle, an educator and former adult actress, had been essential to the effort as she provided insight into the exploitative practices employed by shifty producers. The trio had aided 4 or 5 different girls but insisted that Laureen had not been one of them. If she had, they would have been more than willing to cooperate, but as it stood, they knew nothing of the girl's fate. Another promising lead came when police began to investigate how a 14-year-old girl had managed to get her hands on a 6-pack of beer and a bottle of wine. When questioned, the two friends who visited Laureen on the night she disappeared claimed that the alcohol had been there when they arrived, and all they had brought were some cigarettes and a small amount of marijuana. They were too excited by the presence of the alcohol to question where it came from, yet they had a pretty good idea of how Laureen had gotten it. On the day she disappeared, one of Laureen's fellow junior high students had spotted her filling the refrigerators at a local convenience store. This had led some to theorize that Laureen had come to some kind of arrangement with the store's owners. Do a little work around the store and receive some alcohol as a payment. But why risk a felony arrest when you could hire someone of legal age? Unfortunately, it has never been categorically proven that the store's owner gave her the alcohol, but to many, such a detail marks a glaringly unexplored avenue of investigation. Such an individual might well have known Laureen was planning on becoming intoxicated that night, and with predatory intention, they might have viewed it as a window of opportunity. Yet while such a theory might have a great deal of credence to it, further developments must be considered. During an autumn night in 1981, Judith Ron was awakened by the sound of her telephone ringing. She picked up the handset, brought the receiver to her ear, and was greeted by the sound of silence. She croaked out a sleepy greeting, but still, the caller remained quiet, and after a few more seconds of chilling silence, they hung up. The call came just after 3:45 a.m., and the next night, the mysterious caller rang again at almost the exact same time. These calls continued on and off for the next several years, with a measured increase in frequency around the holiday season. Laureen's aunt Janet was also the recipient of some mysterious calls in the years following her niece's disappearance. Much like the calls made to Judith, Janet was generally met with silence whenever she answered the calls. But on one occasion, the person on the other end spoke up. Janet later said that she was certain that the caller was a teenage girl and that they asked only to speak to Mike. Mike was Janet's son and Laureen's first cousin. While the vast majority referred to him as Michael, only Laureen would call him Mike. On the rare occasion that Michael would answer the mysterious late-night calls, the caller would remain completely silent and then hang up after just a couple of minutes. For a long time, Judith believed the calls were in some way connected to her daughter's disappearance, but in the end, when she found the strength to move on with her life, she changed her phone number and the calls abruptly ceased. In the months after the phone calls stopped, Laureen's case grew cold and the police officers working on it were reassigned. It wasn't until 1985 that there was a development in the case, and it was as mysterious as it was shocking. The male friend Laureen had been hanging out with on the night of her disappearance was never publicly named due to his young age, but when he was found hanging by a rope in his one-bedroom apartment, the news found its way to Judith with alarming speed. Whether or not he left a note remains unclear, but if he did, no details were ever made public. Why he chose to take his own life will forever remain a mystery, but one can't help but wonder if some kind of latent guilt was behind it. The fact remains, we have no idea what actually happened in the lead up to Laureen's disappearance, and although the police never formally considered him a suspect, his sudden death seems awfully suspicious. Shortly after receiving word of her friend's death, Judith Ron was contacted by a woman named Carol Jensen. Carol, a private investigator, worked for a non-profit organization known as Wings for Children. Their goal was to provide support for families of missing children, and in certain cases, when there was a possibility that the child was still alive, they would provide their own private investigators. Judith shared every detail of her ordeal, from the night Laureen disappeared to the ghost calls that persisted every night for years. After hearing the account, Carol knew exactly where to begin her search. She located the Santa Monica motel that Laureen was believed to have called, and upon arriving, she discovered that it was far from an ordinary roadside rest stop. The motel was infested with pimps, prostitutes, and drug dealers. By bribing a few local meth heads, Carol stumbled upon something horrifying. It is important to note that the information obtained likely came from a drug addict who would say anything for a few dollars, so it must be taken with skepticism. However, due to one specific detail provided, we have little choice but to consider it in our theories. One guest Carol Jensen spoke to claimed to have seen numerous children around Laureen's age being taken in and out of the motel's rooms, always without a parent or guardian present. When pressed for further details, the informant appeared eager to continue but required another cash payment to share more. What they revealed was profoundly disturbing. The informant suspected that the motel served as a front for traffickers who used it as a venue for producing explicit images of children. Although she didn't know the traffickers' names, she had overheard some of the prostitutes referring to their leader as Dr. Z. Was this possibly the same physician who operated the teen health hotline? And if so, could his entire operation have been a cover for the exploitation of children? That same year, Roger Moray, a child friend of Laureen's, received a phone call. Roger was unable to speak, but his mother asked who was calling. "It's Lori," came the response, and when Roger's mom asked if she could take a message, the caller hung up. The numerous phone calls had led some to believe that Laureen was still alive and well, at least at the time that they were placed. They posit that after being exploited by Dr. Z and his accomplices, Laureen was simply too ashamed to return home. However, she still wished to hear the voices from time to time. It's a heartbreaking story, yet one that's dismissed entirely by the more cynically minded. One amateur sleuth stated that if Laureen was indeed exploited, she was most likely killed shortly afterward as a loose end to be tied up. But if that was the case, who was making the phone calls? As dark and disturbing as it may seem, the traffickers themselves might have been placing the calls as a sick form of entertainment. They could have recorded Laureen saying a few words, perhaps the names of the family members she longed for, and then, when played over the phone to her grieving relatives, they would no doubt be filled with false hope. It's also possible that they didn't need to record Laureen saying anything and simply used another abducted girl of a similar age in her place. After all, if that really was Laureen on the phone, why didn't she ever say anything other than her request to speak to her cousin, Mike? Sure, it's possible she was too ashamed at first, but complete silence, year in and year out, and she never once found it in herself to say, "I love you, Mom." It's a deeply sinister theory, one made all the more gut-wrenching by the fact that the so-called Dr. Z was never properly investigated for his possible involvement in Laureen's disappearance. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.